I'm going to tell you a little bit about fractals and what they are and how they were discovered and what you can actually use them for. So numbers are everywhere, especially today, where pretty much any human endeavor is permeated by numbers and math and equations and formulas. And math can help us understand the world. It enables us to do a lot of things. It enables us to plan, enables us to construct, it enables us to shape the world and build tools, enables us to fly spaceships, enables us to build cities. It pretty much enables our Western civilization. And it also affects our worldview, because the tools, the mathematic tools that we use to view the world actually works as a prism. And that prism affects how we view it, how we interpret it. And for the past over 2,000 years, how we view the world has been shaped pretty much by what is called Euclidean geometry. It was invented by a guy called Euclid, 300 BC in Greece, and it's been very, very useful. Euclidean geometry, you've seen it before, it's like these very simple shapes. They come in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, and 3 dimensions, and they're used for pretty much all you can think of when it comes to building tools and machinery and stuff like that. So it's been highly useful, and without it we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are. So Euclidean geometry, it's important to keep in mind that this is a model of looking at stuff. It's an approximation. It isn't reality itself. That's an important distinction, because if we follow a model too blindly, we risk mistaking the approximation for the reality, and we may start to avoid stuff that it doesn't fit the model. And that can lead to all kinds of things. And it formulates our questions also on how the world works. But for the past couple of decades, increasingly, we have been moving beyond the mechanistic universe of Euclidean geometry. And starting in the 19th century, physicists and mathematicians started to think beyond this way of looking at the universe, because there were a lot of things that couldn't be explained by Euclidean geometry at all. Because lightning doesn't follow a straight line, a cloud is not a sphere, a mountain is not a cone, etc. And there were all kinds of, phenomena that couldn't be explained. So they wanted to explain it, and they started to explore new ways of doing that. And in this process, they came up with chaos theory and fractals. And it was a totally different way of looking at things. And a fractal, they're created by repeating a simple process over and over in a feedback loop, like this line, for instance, that folds back on itself. And it gets increasingly complicated. This is actually called a space-filling fractal curve. And it's space-filling because it starts to act like a plane. The more it folds in on itself, the more plane-ish it becomes. So fractals exist sort of in between our usual dimensions. You can have a fractal dimension of a line that is 1.5 or 1.8 or whatever, depending on how complex it is. And a fractal plane can also appear to be an object. And if you look at this closely, you will see that this looks like an object. It resembles an object, but it actually consists of nothing but holes. It's only holes, but it looks like a triangle or a pyramid. And in fractals, the smallest details usually resemble a hole. And these kind of look familiar, don't they? And that's because we're surrounded by fractals pretty much everywhere you look. Trees grow in fractal patterns. Snowflakes are fractals. River deltas are also fractals. Broccoli is a nice example of a classical fractal. It's kind of weird how they look, but they insist on looking that way. Nobody knows why. Plants do the same thing for no reason we can think of, but maybe they think it's cool. This is Tibet seen from space. You can see that Tibet is a pretty fractalized place. And a lot of living organisms display fractals, including us, because our nervous systems and our lungs, in this picture, they're also fractals. Same goes for our veins, etc. And even the distribution of matter in the galaxy is distributed according to fractal principles. And one of the pioneers in discovering all this and studying all this was a guy called Benoit Mandelbrot. And he started doing this in the 70s. And he was ridiculed a fair amount by his colleagues and peers because nobody really understood why he was doing this, because there were already tools to explain pretty much everything. And the stuff that we couldn't explain, we just ignored. Like the dynamics of fluids, for example, or gases and stuff like that, that just couldn't be calculated. So he used an example just to show the difference between fractal geometry and let's say, normal geometry. The coast of England turns out to be infinitely long. It all depends on the size of the ruler. So if you measure Britain's coast with a ruler that is 200 kilometers long, it's a very long ruler. It turns out that the coast is 2,400 kilometers long. I'm from Europe, so I'm going to insist on using kilometers just to piss you guys off. But it turns out very quickly that the shorter the ruler you use, the longer the coast becomes. And you can imagine, you can see the difference between these numbers. 2,400 moves up to 3,400. They're both correct in a sense, but it just shows that it's kind of arbitrary. It's just what you choose, where you choose to stop. Because the further you look, the more detail you will see, because England is a fractal. It's a giant fractal. And if you try to measure England's coast with a ruler that is a fraction of an inch long, you're going to be measuring for a very, very long time. And England's coast is going to be pretty much infinitely long, which also means that England is much, much bigger than the United States. If you like. If you choose it to be that way. So Mandelbrot, he noticed that when he was calculating fractal algorithms, he started plotting them on paper. They generated very unusual shapes of surprising complexity. He was doing this on paper first, with pen and paper, and it took him a very, very long time, as you can imagine. And these are called orbital fractals, which means that you calculate how many times a pixel orbits what is called a strange attractor, the center of the fractal, which is like a black hole pretty much. And if it goes in, it gets a specific color. If it goes out, it gets another. So that's how you plot this stuff. So somewhere in there is a black hole. And luckily for Benoit Mandelbrot, unlike his peers, he had access to pretty powerful computers because he lived in California and he worked at IBM. So when they started plotting these on computers, shapes started to emerge a little more clearly. And the Mandelbrot set was discovered after him. He was one of the discoverers of it. And it's been called the most complex mathematic object in history. And a mathematic object, sounds kind of weird, but a circle, for instance, is a mathematic object. It doesn't exist anywhere in the real world. It's just a shape. And it's defined by numbers. If you look at something that is a shape in the real world, it's not going to be a perfect circle. The closer you get to it, the less of a circle it's going to be. But the Mandelbrot set is also a mathematic object. It's just way, way more complex than a circle. And because it is a fractal, it displays very different properties. If you zoom into a circle, a mathematic circle displays less and less detail. But if you zoom into a fractal, it's going to do the opposite. So when he started rendering these in full color, which started to be possible only in the 1980s, this is what he came up with. And when he released these results in 1985 in Scientific American, it caused a worldwide storm because nobody had seen anything like it. It was totally unexpected, especially coming from such a simple little formula. And it turned out pretty quickly that the Mandelbrot set, because you could actually look at it for the first time, it was infinitely complex. It was infinitely detailed. And it sort of created a visual manifesto for a new way of looking at the world and inspired people to see the world and mathematics in a different light. So there's a sort of a philosophical dimension to this as well. So, and this is what got me hooked with fractals in a CAD facility in Stockholm, Sweden, 25 years ago, and on a really crappy Unix computer, where I found a really cool fractal program. And so I stayed there all night and just kept zooming into the Mandelbrot set because you can zoom into it infinitely. And the thing that is cool with it is that it doesn't repeat itself. There are fractals that repeat themselves endlessly, but Mandelbrot set displays new details and new shapes. And you can never really tell what you're going to see in there. It's like a parallel universe on its own. You can see that here's a very shallow zoom of a place called Seahorse Valley. So these different parts of it have different names. There's the Elephant Valley, and there's the Electric Coast, and there's places like that because they sort of to capture what they're about. And why they do that, nobody has any idea at all. And it also shows up in totally different fractal equations. It shows up in magnetic fields, in the alignment of magnetic fields, and stuff like that, which is very weird. And people are looking at it and trying to crack what it's about, but nobody has really come up with any good explanations yet. You can also see that it contains little miniature copies of itself, an infinite number, of course, of those. And they, in turn, contain copies of themselves. They're vaguely different. So it goes on forever, and I mean literally forever. And it turns out that once you start zooming into the Mandelbrot set, a couple of thousand times, a couple of million times, you do that in a couple of minutes, even with pretty primitive computers, then the Mandelbrot set is actually bigger than our galaxy. So the equation that your computer has to keep in memory is bigger than the galaxy. And if you zoom in a couple of billion times more, or even a trillion times more, there are people doing this constantly. It turns out that it's bigger than the known universe, a lot bigger. And I'm just going to share with you some of the shapes that I've found, which I'm going to feature in an upcoming book about the Mandelbrot set. It's a little like nature photography in a sense. I didn't invent the Mandelbrot set, just like I didn't invent a tree or a plant or whatever I want to photograph. But I can appreciate it, and I can let it come to life using shades and colors and by choosing the motive. So just to show you some of the variety that you can find down there. Some places are pretty serene and nice. Some are sort of look like jewelry. Some are really pretty powerful and simple. Some are a little angry and electric. And here's one of the copies that you find down there. And here's a place that looks like it's vaguely underwater for some reason. And after the Mandelbrot set, more fractal types were discovered. I mean, we have hundreds of different fractal types now, and some are radically different from each other. And first it started off with one-dimensional and two-dimensional fractals. This is something called a flame fractal. They're kind of nice for album covers. This is another one. And your guess on why it looks the way that it does is as good as anyone's, because nobody knows. But they're kind of cool. It's another one.
Why do they look metallic?
That's because the person who made them chose a texture that was metallic or chose the colors. But the shapes, they're in the fractal. But it depends on if you want to render them in black or white, or render them in color. They can look pretty garish, like hippie artwork for people with very little aesthetics. But here's another flame fractal. It shows just how cool they are and how mysterious they can look. And just a couple of years ago, a group of friends on a fractal forum, actually starting in Sweden, cracked the problem of how to render them in 3D. And that opened up a whole new bag of weirdness that made all the fractals before that look normal. So here's one. And here's what is called the Mandelbox. And it's a box version of the Mandelbrot set. And since it's a fractal, it's infinite. So you can zoom in there as well. And it's a world unto its own. You go into a little nook or cranny, and you're going to find all kinds of weirdness in there. And you can texturize it. You can make it look metal or make it look like lichen or whatever. So it can look like this. This is looks like a Sierpinski variation. This is a mix of, I think, 3 or 4 equations. That's the cool thing with 3D fractals. You can mix different equations and mix different fractals. So people are doing this all the time. And there's a lot of forums, people are comparing the weirdness that they find. And so isn't this crazy? And everybody goes, well, wow. So here's another one, talking about crazy. And it just, insists on looking like that. And nobody knows why. And there's a kind of sense of humor to it as well. I mean, those little guys growing, they're after something. I don't know what it is. And crazy, like I said, this is kind of crazy as well. So, and you find all kinds of weirdness, and you can zoom around in there for literally forever, and you will find stuff that nobody else has ever seen. And that's also one of the fascinations with fractals to me, that every single picture I take in there I'm the first living person to see it, because it's infinite. Nobody is able to replicate it. I just zoom in a couple of million times, and I've lost anyone that's in pursuit. It's kind of easy to do that. Here's another one which looks radically different from the one before. But the underlying math is pretty much the same. Very, very short little formulas that you should think wouldn't be able to describe anything with. So here's another one. The artist called this one, "Don't Point That Thing at Me." And I can understand why he called it that. But I have no idea why it looks the way that it does, and neither has he. But he found it. And I'm going to show you, since it's 3D, they're kind of cool because you can animate them. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. This is a project that I'm working on for VR platforms, because you can actually go into a 3D fractal and look at it on say, the Oculus Rift or something like that, which is fairly awesome. That's one of my favorite worlds that I found. I call it the Steel Caverns, and it goes on forever. So I'm working on a 4K version of that, which is soon completed, and also an Oculus version that's going to be fairly mind-blowing. So chaos theory and fractals, they represent a radically different way of explaining the world, and they're useful for all kinds of things. So are there any practical applications of fractals beyond the immediately what comes to mind? So and there actually is. There's a lot of applications to fractals. You can calculate dynamic systems with them, and you can do all kinds of stuff that you can't do with Euclidean geometry or mathematics. And because they resemble nature so much, they can also be used to mimic nature and all kinds of natural phenomena with realistic results, which also helps us understand it better. This is a very simple fractal terrain generator. This looks like it's fairly old, but it's you have all kinds of applications doing this stuff. And when you do a fractal terrain, you start up with something pretty simple. You just generate a random fractal, and you can put in some mist or something so it looks a little cooler. But once you start populating it with fractal trees and fractal snow and fractal hills and fractal clouds, it becomes something else. It starts to resemble reality. And this is not even a very good example, but I'm just bringing it in to show you, some of the parameters you can see around there. Is a lot of parameters. And since everything on that image is mathematics, everything, every single little thing, it's rendered. So here's an example. This is a Lufthansa commercial. And not a single thing in that photo is real. The mountains, the Alps, as they look like, they're just fractals. The snow is fractal. The clouds are fractals. And the planes, of course, are rendered in 3D. So, and this sort of, starts to beg the question that we're sort of what we see as real is not necessarily real. And I'm going to show you an example of how fractals are used in games, because pretty much any game that you play has a lot of fractals in them. You just don't think about it. I mean, anytime you go to a movie or play a game, you will see fractals. Like this one is from the Pirates of the Caribbean. Water is fractals, the sky is fractals, so you don't have to sit around and wait for the ocean to calm down, to just render it the way that you want it. And we're starting to, having to ask the question, what's real and what isn't. We have to be aware of it in a way that we haven't before, because pretty much everything looks real. It's not Star Trek from 1965 any longer. And of course, everything you see here are fractals as well. And so we're blurring the line between what's real and what's not. Here you have a sailing boat sailing a fractal reef. And it's kind of hard to, it feels like it's there. At least it's somewhere. And to me, the very idea that something infinitely complex and even beautiful can be the result of such simple beginnings, that might tell us something about how life in the universe works. And at least to me, fractals are mysterious. I mean, where do these shapes come from? And why do they look like they do? And what are the implications of all this? And maybe the way that we approach the questions are more important than the answers, so we don't make the mistake of confining how we see reality to our limited models. We must let what we find shape our models and stay open to surprises, because we're going to get a lot of surprises when we look at nature. It's not only how black holes work, it's about how everything works on the largest scale and the tiniest scale. And I'm going to leave you with a question that has been on the minds of a lot of mathematicians a couple of past decades, is that what if everything is fractals? And what if the universe itself is a fractal? So there's something to think about. I have no idea. But it's a cool question. And if you think this is interesting and you're interested in the upcoming book that I'm working on, just feel free to contact me. And if you can work out my name, which is much harder than rendering any fractal, then feel free to contact me. Thank you.